It's funny. I've been looking forward to doing this for a little bit now, and I was taking some notes last night, and this is another part of my prep, which is I've decided not to prep for most things because then I don't know, like I don't know, there's like an appropriate amount of prep, and I was thinking about like where I wanted to start and what to start with, and I mean there's a lot of different stuff here, but I think the question I want to start with, which is probably the biggest question, is how do we get to SASE? Like what was the I feel like in a lot of technology stuff we have iterative like steps, and then things come out of left, just like out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden, like thank you Gartner, we have SASE, and then everybody just kind of just piles in, and now we have like this animal that's out there. But how did we actually get here? Like what was this the before and that step that really took us into what we talk about now in SASE in the market?
Like max overload?
Yeah,
No,
like all the way
no
in.
pun intended,
Yeah,
by the way.
there's a new,
Uh,
new new name for the show.
I think it was just, it was tool overload, right? It
Mhm.
was just the culmination of, a product to fix a problem,
Mhm.
and in a bit of a vacuum, in a bit of a silo, and that just amassed right over time. And IT organizations suddenly found themselves without the resources to manage, to maintain, to design properly, to integrate properly. And I think the net result is gaps that weren't expected to be there. And I think SASE, or whatever you want to call it at the time, it obviously wasn't called SASE
Mhm.
originally, but this desire to make things simpler again, to kind of converge all these different domains and focuses and technology, bring them together in a sort of a singular way or a singular model or architecture.
As soon as we have a definition, so SASE, the next thing that happens is every supplier, service provider, vendor, ODM, OEM, whatever acronym we want to put on it, right? Their marketing team then runs into it. Oh, we checked the box. Like it works. We are this thing. And and I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. When years and years ago, it was like clustering. Clustering was the big thing. So it was everybody's like, oh, we support clustering. Well, what kind of clustering do you support? And then you have to get into like all these nuanced conversations around, well, yeah, we're this because we, like, yeah, we can kind of technically check that box. And I feel like the same thing, of course, I mean, has happened. It happened with SD-WAN. It's, SSE, right? Now we have SASE. And and then of course you get acronym soup, right? So SASE is in of itself a breakdown of a lot of different acronyms. And how do for somebody, it's like trying to figure this out and like walk through this of like understanding the marketing mess that's been created of, like why, what is it? What should it be? How do you figure out if you're getting into the right thing or the wrong thing? Walk me through trying to unpack that.
I think it's difficult for the enterprise, frankly. Um, it's not uncommon, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
Somebody floats, some analyst says, "Hey, here's something new," and supplier one, check; supplier two, check; supplier three, check. And you've got everybody doing it suddenly. When yesterday nobody did it, and so it's difficult to kind of weed through the marketing, weed through what's real, what's fake, what's eventually I'll have it, but I want to tell you I have it today. It's difficult. The enterprise has to do it themselves. It's a lot of legwork to dig into the well. How are you doing it? Don't just tell me you can. Show me. Or talking to trusted advisors and consultants that have gone through that already, who've done a lot of that legwork already. And I think there's definitely a value in that.
Well, break down the acronyms inside of SASE and how this gets expressed now. Of, I mean, what you're buying. Like, why do you buy SASE? What is SASE considered at this point? Like, how does somebody say, I mean, what there's like seven acronyms inside of SASE that gets packaged together. What is that? What is it doing? Why are you getting it?
Oh boy. Yeah, there's a few acronyms, aren't there? You
Hmm.
know, you've got firewall as a service, you've got SWIG,
Hmm.
you've got CASB, DLP, RBI. I think they're trying to jam digital experience monitoring into that now to kind of amplify the value of the network story. But there's SD-WAN, of course, the access piece, ZTNA or SDP. There's a lot, and it's growing, right? It's it's where it is today, but it may be something greater than that tomorrow. And you know, you the idea to bring it all together into sort of a single unified solution. I mean, that's like utopia, right? For enterprises, I think they're looking for a way to make their world a little bit easier. And unless you're a very, very large enterprise with a $2 billion IT budget and infinite, IT resources, you have to figure out how to do things a little bit easier. You have to simplify your world. And it's the goal is to obviously is to simplify, but it's also to cover the gaps, right? If you can adopt a solution that allows you to do that in the right way, you can significantly remove risk in serviceability and uptime for your business, but also de-risking your environment from threats.
Firewall as a service, so, secure web gateway, RBI, remote access, ZTNA, SD-WAN, CASB, DLP, digital experience monitoring. Um, then you probably get into endpoint. Some EDR function is getting put into
Sure.
SASE now. Then you can also talk about this like line is blurring also into MDR. Also is kind of getting blurred into to SASE. So if I was going to say like, give me like a 2 or 3 minute spiel on each one of those, like just down the list.
Sure. On the access side, it's pretty simple. I think networking hasn't evolved as dramatically as the cyber landscape has. So SD-WAN, frankly, is about optimizing the transport that you have available to you and making sure you can access the resources you need, whether they're resources in the public internet, if they're resources in a private colo or a hyperscaler like an AWS or GCP. The idea is to de-risk the transport that exists between the user or the office and the resource you're trying to access. And that's SD-WAN in a nutshell. And of course, there's lots of different mechanics that do that de-risking for an enterprise. On the security side, it's I think it's really about getting deeper and deeper into the traffic, into the payload. We first start with sort of the SWIG. Let's look at the HTTP traffic, right? What URL is it going to? Does that adhere to my corporate policies to remove risk in general, whether it's a phishing website or it's a spam bot website or some other high risk kind of domain, or maybe it's a productivity play. You want to eliminate social, etc. And so you start there, and then you get deeper, right? Deeper in removing some of the risks that are, say, less intentional risks that, say, an intrusion prevention system or an inline NG anti-malware solution might be, where we're actually inspecting the payload or inspecting the behavior of the traffic, looking at reputation or certain types of destination IPs or destination countries, for that matter. And you get deeper into the packet, and we're looking at controlling action. Hey, it's not enough for some enterprises to say no file services online. We need file services. It's part of our business, but we need to control what we can do with specific file services. So now we dip into the CASB world, where we're controlling action based on, say, specific accounts or tenants, corporate OneDrive versus personal OneDrive, and what you can or can't do. And of course, then the data loss side of things, the DLP side of things, which is just getting better introspection into the sensitive data or the data in general that's in those payloads. It's not DLP. I think oftentimes is looked at as a security mechanism. It's not really a security mechanism. It's a control mechanism. It's the bad guys, if they wanted to send and exfiltrate sensitive data, they could do that, whether you've got DLP or not, right? It's more about sort of the unexpected insider threat, right? Or the unintentional upload of sensitive data. But the idea is I'm controlling what kind of data exits or enters my enterprise with these kinds of controls. And you've got RBI, for example. Now we're looking at, okay, hey, I can't just block every URL that's, say, undefined or uncategorized, because that creates an impact on productivity for my user community. So I need to silo that off. I need to send that traffic to a protected, isolated environment where my user's not at risk, but they can do their job, right? They can go to that website that maybe hasn't yet been categorized or defined. And we start dipping in further into the endpoint, and then in contextual correlation with XDR and creating remediation on top of that. And you mentioned XDR, MDR, and MPP. We're just getting closer to the user, and then getting more intelligent with all the data we have, right? Because if we're getting it from all these, we're getting it from the network, we're getting it from the security engines, we're getting it from the endpoint, from the applications. Now, what do we do with all that data? How do we make that data meaningful? That's where XDR comes in. And then, of course, adding remediation on top of that is key, right?
The boy, I have a couple places I want to go with this right now. I'm just gonna make notes so I can circle back. A big disconnect that I've noticed in procurement of IT systems is the dialogue between an IT practitioner and the organization. And here in IT, we think about it in terms of IT things, right? We and when you get deeper into like the sales side of it, it's like speeds and feeds and all these different acronyms start coming up. But ultimately, we could say, come down this list, right? I'll just pick on one, right? Secure web gateway. If you go to sell a secure web gateway to an enterprise and you say, hey, we want to buy this capability we don't have today, and we want to introduce this to our environment, that immediately gets evaluated in terms of what is this displacing, or how much is it going to cost, what is it displacing, and you get into this financial thing, and the acronym I hate the most is ROI, right? Because immediately you get into these things of like, well, how do you judge this purchase? And that purchase is judged based on what does it return to us, and that is really disjointed, of course, because if you say we're going to introduce something as a new functionality or a new capability that we don't currently have, well, how do you quantify a return on that investment in terms of like you have an input and an output, which becomes like this very like foundational idea in business.
Sure.
So what I get really curious about with these things is underlying requirements that surface of we need to solve a problem. And what is that business problem? So you talk about DLP in terms of control. What immediately goes to me with DLP is not, necessarily the outsider threat, the external threat. It's more of these basic things of, Johnny is leaving the company, and we know he's leaving the company because 5 days before he gave his notice, he downloaded the entire financial archive of the business onto his personal laptop. And I've seen multiple organizations that go through that and then say, okay, we want to make sure this never happens to us again. And how do we prevent it? And that's not an ROI based sale. Now you're talking about you've got something else. And as much as SASE becomes this like we're going to throw everything into the pot, but there's still a lot of things within this platform that we talk about that are solving problems for a business that aren't necessarily, what I would say in like terms of like a direct replacement or rip and replace or efficiencies. And I'm curious what your thought on that is, and I'm putting you on the spot with this one, but like, in that case of DLP, CASB is another good example of that. Nobody really knows what CASB means. I mean, now you define like the CASB and DLP, and some vendors in the SASE space even put RBI into the same kind of like idea around, just inspecting payload and controlling access to data. But what are organizations actually getting out of these things that they weren't getting beforehand that then drive these purchases? Because a lot of times you're talking about them spending money they haven't spent in the past. You have a firewall on premise, and then you go into this platform, and then you add these functions. I mean, you're increasing your cost in some cases. Sure. So other than it's cool, which I agree, it's awesome, you know, and it's really good, and everybody should run it. But for somebody that's not involved in this day to day, like what are they getting that they don't have before that all of a sudden they can look at and they can say, okay, this changes something for us in our organization.
I think it starts with knowing what you didn't know.
Hmm.
I think is a big part of it. We've got threats coming at us left and right in lots of different ways, and everyone's a target, right? And so on one hand, you can kind of look at the threats as, hey, they don't care about me, and maybe the risk is perceived as being so low that having this additional visibility and control is not warranted. But then it happens. I can tell you, prior to my stint at CATO Networks, I spent 12 years in managed services with the small regional MSP here in North Texas, and I would say the last 3 to 4 years of my time there, running operations, the cyber practice, the networking practice, I can't tell you the number of money grams I had to buy, the Bitcoin I had to acquire, and the countless number of times I had to visit, tour to pay off some ransom to get access to decrypt. And these are for small businesses,
Hmm.
because it was the target at the time was all small, medium businesses. We're talking one site, 50 users, to as many as 100 sites and maybe a couple thousand users. So everyone's a target now. Everyone that can be a target is a target, and it's not just for the large, Wells Fargos of the world. No, those are the hard ones to go after. The smaller enterprises that have less controls and less insurance in place, they're the easier targets. They're the low hanging fruit, and I think that you don't know what that value is until you've had to go through that experience. And I think that once you do, or once you hear about it, um, the investment into having greater visibility and control, it's a no brainer.
I mean, that's a chicken and egg problem though, because until you've had the experience, you don't understand what it is. And even reading and regurgitating things out of like Verizon's DBIR, right? Like this percentage of businesses are going to have a cyber incident or a breach, and that percentage are going to have the average cost is this much money. And you read these numbers and they seem insane, right? Like, oh, the average cost of a breach is X million dollars. Like why? I'm a like you said, 50-person, 100-person, 200-person company. Like, why is this going to cost me $4 million? Um, and and so that's, I mean, this is how does this change? Like at what point? I have my theories on it, but I mean, you sat in the seat and you helped organizations deal with this. Like, how many of those organizations survived the process? How many didn't survive the process? And then afterwards, how many actually invested in making sure it didn't happen to them again?
That's a great question. I think in all cases, the businesses survived the
That's
experience.
great news.
It's debatable how one one organization, one business felt the severity of the experience impacted their business. Um, this is 10 years ago.
Hmm.
Many had not gone through sort of that digital transformation yet, right? So the resources were local. There wasn't a complete cutoff. It was easy to get to, say, backup resources. There were a lot of other elements about their environment that were far more fragile to consider.
Hmm.
But I would say that I couldn't put a specific percentage on how many saw the light and how many did not. I would probably say at the time, fewer saw the light and were ready to kind of get those crap dice back out and roll them again. But there certainly were some who understood that it wasn't about the data in the end to them. It wasn't about the inaccessibility of the data. It was about what it did to operations, to their business, how it impacted their customer experience in the end. I don't have your information. I'm sorry. I can't look it up. We're in the middle of an event right now. And how many times they may have had to repeat that kind of response to their customers. And they'll never know to what extent really that impacted the relationship they had with that customer as a result. So there definitely were some that saw the light and knew that it was time to make a change.
You say everyone's a target. I want to get your answer to this one.
You and I are a target even.
I'm not. I want your answer to this one, because this is and you made a really good example, Wells Fargo, right? There becomes this perception: I don't have anything that a hacker wants. I'm not Wells Fargo, right? I've had similar conversations. Oh, nobody's going to come after me. Like, why is that not true?
Why is what not true?
Why is everyone a target? Why is it not true that somebody would say, I'm not a target, I'm not Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Chase, I don't have anything a hacker wants, I'm not a target?
Do you have money that you want to keep? If you've got something that they can leverage to get you to come out of pocket to return to you, then you're a target. You're a target. And it's so easy, especially with modern day tooling. Now you've got AI that's coming on the scene, right? It's making it easier. It's making it easier for people who are novice at doing this kind of thing. Now they're able to massively multiply, and you've got ransomware as a service being sold now on the in the dark web. So now you don't I'm not into that, but heck, if I wanted to, it wouldn't be too hard. And it's easy. Hey, here's a link. Here's a carefully crafted email. Here's a phishing kit that looks a lot like your Office 365 account that I can spin up on an instant, in some hyperscaler somewhere. It's not, the friction is low to get into it. And as long as you've got money and you've got, that one picture, you just can't do without.
My explanation has become very simplistic on this one. The second you connect to the internet, you're done, right? Like now you're in the game, you're in the ring, like you're there. It's and if you're like a network practitioner or a security practitioner, or you're in IT, you've probably seen these things where you go out and it's like, how long before you plug a computer into the internet before it gets its first scan, and how long before it's exploited if it has known vulnerabilities attached to it. I mean, it's frighteningly fast, right? And the other one that I've tried to explain to people is, you're dealing with people whose professional jobs, like they feed their families based on doing this. You get really good at something if your income is dependent on it, and feeding your children is dependent on it, and then you practice it day in and day out at scale. Like, just go to the gym and lift weights every day. You're gonna get stronger. It's the same thing, Like, what do you do? Oh, I sent out 20,000 impersonation emails today, and I got 4 today. Like, well, what did it cost you to send out those 20,000 emails? Nothing. And okay, you got 4, and what'd you get? Oh, I got $10,000. You're like, okay, great. Now tomorrow we're gonna send out 40,000 emails and try to get 10. Like, it's not. It's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of these organizations are unbelievably sophisticated.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever received a call, one of those calls, and actually kind of played through it to see where it would go?
I haven't live answered one. I get a bunch, that my I've screening on my devices, so I've had a bunch in voicemail where you listen back to it, and I kind of, the problem with it, I think, is the second part is it's always, timing, right? And you just get into, even the best people, if they get that call at the wrong time, it changes the whole game for them. And
Sure.
really savvy, sophisticated, people in tech and crypto, for instance, have been, socially engineered just because they had, the wrong series of events just intersected at the exact right time for them, and they were toast.
Yeah.
And these are professionals. So what do? You say the average person has any shot? Like,
it is getting hard.
I've always I thought for a long time that cyber insurance was going to push this needle a lot farther. And and we see it kind of happening, but it hasn't like tipped over the way that I thought it was, 4 or 5 years ago. What do you think actually drives mass awareness and mass adoption of just, I'm not saying like, everybody tries to equate this to like CIA level security. Like, I'm not even talking about CIA level security. I'm talking about like you just have a padlock on your gate, kind of level stuff.
I mean, you see it. It's everywhere now. Like you can't watch a movie with some reference to social engineering or some cyber threat. So I think that you're seeing a lot of awareness being raised in just day to day social activities.
But when does that
Um,
go from like awareness to I actually have to do something to protect myself? Right? This is the thing. I unfortunately know people that have had their burglaries, right? Whether it was commercially or residentially, right? But the average person probably hasn't experienced a home, their house being robbed. But the average person is still locking their front door when they leave their house. Why? Well, they don't have personal experience that they have to lock their door. They just know we have to lock our door before when we leave our house because we want to prevent this outcome from happening. When do like the average company person, I guess we're talking about people ultimately because they're
sure.
making decisions. When does the average person wake up one day and say, hey, I need to like actually do X, Y, and Z for my company here because I, don't want somebody walking in the door?
That's a great question, and a great analogy, by the way. I think that there's a lot of trust. It's Wells Fargo, it's Bank of America, so I inherently just trust it. I don't have to worry about my money. I don't have to worry about my credentials. And I think you could relate that trust to so many other online solutions, technologies, platforms, services. So I think we're trusting. We're very trusting that these risks that seem, at least as a perception by very many people, um, well, we're insulated against them because of the institutions that we do business with. But we hear more and more about how these institutions are being exploited. Information is being exfiltrated. But even then, the average person isn't hearing about that, right? To you and I, we're tapped into that community, right? We're seeing those feeds come up in our LinkedIn and our socials, and we're reading through them, and it's front and center for us. But for the average Joe, probably not so much. They're not seeing that. So I think until all the other different types of news feeds are also looking at that a little bit more, like this is important. It's yeah. There's war here and there's war there, and those are undoubtedly significant. It's not the only war, right, that's going on, and we're not necessarily as a community, as humanity, we're not putting as much attention on this other war, this kind of silent war that's going on all the time. It's like, when you were a kid and you were looking for bugs, you find the biggest rock that hasn't been moved in ages.
Mhm.
Looks like a nice shiny rock, but you lift that rock up and there's just all sorts of, living organism going on underneath it. And that's like what's happening behind the scenes, under the rock of our computer or under the rock of our smartphone. It's like that's constantly going on, and most people just either don't care, don't believe it, or don't think it's as big of a threat. And I think until we raise that level of awareness everywhere, within reason, we're just not going to buy into it as much.
Humans have a phenomenal capacity of just not believing bad things are going to happen to us, right?
Exactly.
And um, the closest answer I've gotten to this question has been scar tissue, right? It takes enough. It takes enough people having stories in their immediate orbit that they want to avoid. Oh, my neighbor lost their job because their company had this event, and then they ended up laying off a bunch of people because they lost key customers, right? How many of those stories would it take you to hear in your neighborhood before you said, "Oh man, I don't want that outcome to happen to me"? So that's what I always thought that was the case. And then you see, and there's a couple really big events I I remember, like are in my mind, right? And the first one was a hospital chain in New England that had a major cyber incident, and ended up having uniformed, like camouflage wearing uniformed National Guard members going device to device, helping them reinstall computers as part of the recovery. And, it's a pretty powerful image when you see a hospital with camouflaged National Guardsmen, putting thumb drives into computers and reimaging boxes, and this, I mean, and it wasn't like one hospital. I mean, it was a major chain. It took down a significant amount of care and ICUs and emergency and, really bad situation. And then the other one more recently is Colonial Pipeline. And again, the imagery that I have from that is seeing videos, and of course, I don't know, it's not widespread, but you see one person with a tarp in the back of a pickup truck filling it up with gasoline. You're like, okay, we've definitely gone off the deep end on this, right? But even in those two markets where you have hyper-specific horrible outcomes that affected everyone on a day-to-day basis for the most part in that market, there's no measurable increase in your baseline cybersecurity posture. Anybody that lived that was affected by Colonial Pipeline could not get gas for their car. Like, obviously, there is an association that bad things can happen to a company related to cybersecurity, but people aren't running out and putting 2FA, in their identity platform and doing X, Y, and Z. And so now I'm just like, I feel like we're screaming into the void a lot of times with this. Just like, yeah, you should do something, but if you don't want to do it, like, I can't convince you to do it. Like,
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that's what the public sees, right? So the public thinks that, hey, this is the target, right? Even when I say the public, like the consumer, right, the average consumer, but also to the business, maybe that small or medium-sized business who is teetering on a decision to invest more or not. That's what they're seeing, but that's not me.
Yeah.
But that's the exception to the rule. That's not the rule. Those aren't happening every day. What's happening every day? It's the small attacks. It's a small, hey, ransomware to this small business, ransomware to this medium-sized business, double extortion techniques, and that's happening on the daily, right? And we don't hear about that, right? As a general consumer, we don't hear about that.
Oh, that also is another good point, right? Because ransomware now is the ultimate outcome that people think of in most cases with cybersecurity, but it's actually not the case. You have you mentioned earlier, you have a chain, you have marketplaces, so you have somebody that's going to exploit and get into into an environment, and they've done their job, and then they sell that credential and that access to somebody else, who then goes figures out what's in there of value, and then they sell it again to other people. And then maybe somebody buys it to launch a ransomware attack because they've decided, well, that's what's valuable, and they're going to, or is it exfiltrating data? Or remember Target, when Target had their breach?
Mm-hmm.
You remember the source of the breach?
Not in particular.
Their HVAC contractor.
Ah, that is right.
Now, who in the HVAC industry would think that they need to have a sophisticated cybersecurity, but they had connections into Target. So Target ends up with effective a keylogger on all their point of sale terminals, taking credit card numbers. What was the source of the? I mean, so you're like, okay, great. You're, the fish tank. Somebody exploited the fish tank. What do they do with it? These aren't crazy stories.
There's some organizations out there that, their sole task is to simulate attacks. And it's interesting to what extent some of these organizations go and how available information is when you don't take a concerted effort to protect it. And in one such example, there's an organization out of the Pacific Northwest who has a drone service.
Oh, geez.
They'll fly drones over your establishment, over your building, and take a picture of people taking smoke breaks with their access cards hanging off their belt loop. And hey, risk.
Do you see this
point of exposure?
See this one with Strava that just came out recently with bodyguards?
Yeah.
So the Strava exploit, I remember years ago, because they'd found service members running the fence line of defense installations that weren't, mapped, right? And there was another one that just happened where they were able to identify movements of protectees by their bodyguard, their security teams, because they would use Strava, and all of a sudden you'd see like the security team would be in another market out for a run or whatever. And you know, it's like the stuff is so it's just there, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want we can go on this about this forever, but SASE is I guess to some degree it's a disruptive technology. You're displacing other things. Now, in some regards, you know, there's this idea of single vendor SASE, and then that becomes, of course, this race that everybody's now in, and there's a lot of other, you know, large manufacturers that are with massive, you know, market caps. They're going out and acquiring pieces and trying to plug pieces in together. And I don't want to talk about necessarily like the outcome of somebody going and making bolt-on acquisitions to try to do technology. We can come back to that maybe, but um, I think we should talk about a little bit about what is being displaced and what is being replaced and why that becomes important for an organization. And you mentioned it briefly, like in the SD-WAN case, because now, you know, SASE includes SD-WAN. Now, there's a lot of SASE vendors in the market that don't actually have the access component and then require somebody else to. So yeah, they're like, yes, we're SASE, but again, we won't talk about that too much. Um, but I want to.
Don't get me started on that.
Oh, I'm really close to going off the deep end on this one. Maybe the new podcast should be like Max with Mezcal, and then it'll be, you know,
That's a great idea.
you know.
I can get down.
So let's talk about what's being displaced and why it's being displaced and why that's actually important and relevant.
Yeah, I think you know, it starts at the edge, like you said,
Mhm.
SD-WAN, the access component. Access isn't just SD-WAN, of course. The user, the endpoint, also serves as an access component, right? When they're remote or when they're in the office. But yeah, SD-WAN, VPN solutions, traditionally serving a remote access use case. From a security standpoint, branch security devices, even to some extent where it's applicable, large data center firewalls that are protecting resources in the data center, both on the kind of public ingress side, but protecting the WAN as well. And then you've got the rest of the acronyms out there, right? The SWIGs, the cloud application security brokers, or just cloud app security solutions, remote browser isolation. These are all the things that are kind of up for grabs as a part of a SASE initiative or a SASE project.
What do you find? I mean, people probably come into this entry point from a lot of different places. I mean, we can pick on the SD-WAN for a little bit, right? And, you know, when I get into the SD-WAN conversation, the first thing I ask is like, well, what are you? What kind of SD-WAN are you? What solution are you actually providing, right? Because, you know, are you an auto magic VPN to site to site SD-WAN? Which, by the way, if you've ever configured VPN on a firewall, you never want to do it again. You know, like oh geez, man. Cisco, I'll pick on the Cisco picks for a little bit in the ASA firewalls. It was like the dark arts of configuration. It's like, oh look, it's working. I have no idea why, but don't breathe on it now.
Oh, but as an engineer, you felt the power.
Oh
The
geez.
power in that knowledge.
Oh, I don't know, man. If I never configure an ASA VPN again, it might be too soon.
All those no NAT statements.
Oh geez. I want to go into like a PTSD conversation here about SD, but SD-WAN, right? So like SD-WAN solves a bunch of different things. You solve, I mean, at its base level, right? By definition, you're providing a cloud-based web interface to manage your appliance, right? That is SD-WAN, right? So, you've got a web interface to manage an appliance that's remote, that's software defined. Okay, so I know vendors that check the box and say that we're SD-WAN as a result of that. Then you've got site-to-site VPN SD-WAN. You've got internet circuit aggregation SD-WAN. You've got MPLS replacement SD-WAN. Then you can talk about overlay, underlay, designs. You've got TCP optimization, usually for either low bandwidth applications or low bandwidth environments or crossing oceans, right? Um, so there's even within that world, we're talking like one piece of the whole SASE puzzle, and you start from a foundation of like, I don't even know like what the difference is between one approach and another and what I actually care about. So when you're talking to people and you're getting into these conversations and saying, okay, fundamentally, in order to provide you this whole thing, now we talk about access. Well, by the way, SD-WAN doesn't cover your endpoint, right? So it doesn't give you your user, it doesn't give you remote access, it doesn't give you these things. But now you start from like a thing of like, okay, well, we know we want to displace our MPLS, or we have a performance issue, or we have what else comes up a lot of times? We want to lower our costs. We want to try to go to cheaper circuits, at our remote locations. Broadband is viable now. Fiber to the X is available. How do you walk somebody through that journey? When you start talking about like, okay, here's an SD-WAN application and access, which then probably turns into we're going to replace our SD-WAN boxes, which then is like our firewall's now in play. Do we replace our firewall? And then it's like, okay, our VPN concentrate, and it becomes this like, avalanche of stuff. So what does that journey really look like in a conversation from start to, I don't want to say start to finish, but, going through that process with somebody thinking about this?
Well, SASE in particular, I think that it starts at a very strategic level, right? The prospect of SASE for an enterprise. What can that achieve? And as mentioned before, it's a lot of operational simplicity, reducing that burden on IT is one of the goals.
Let's quantify that for a second?
Sure.
'Cause I know this gets said a lot, but I don't think a lot of people really understand what this means. So I'll give you a scenario. Let's say we'll pick a squarely mid-market company, 2,000 employees, figure that's spread out over 20 to 30 sites. And, now because it's, we're post-COVID, you're going to have a remote workforce in a given time about, I don't know, let's call it 50%, in any given time, but it's not consistent. Like people go remote, they work from home, they come into the office and they're back and forth. What does that actually mean in terms of IT overhead in a legacy environment? And you can talk about component, however you want to phrase this, but let's talk about that start.
Yeah, sure. I would say it depends on the type of SASE solution you're looking at. But the primary goal of SASE is to automate and simplify through convergence, and obviously through a cloud native adopted architecture, whatever you want to call it. The difficulty with most suppliers is actually being able to provide that net result. So I can speak from personal experience. Look, I've been that Cisco ASA PIX guy. I knew what it was like to manage a full mesh IPVPN network. I knew what it was like to manage incumbent sort of legacy MPLS architectures. Very complicated, very hands-on, nothing really automated. A lot of critical thinking, which isn't a bad thing. But just a lot of investment by IT resources in maintaining those technologies, those ways of doing things. And what SASE and what SD-WAN should do in the end is to simplify that, right? Add software intelligence, do more kind of point and clicky versus CLI. And maintenance is a big part of that. Fundamentally, the supplier of SASE should be maintaining those technologies for you, maintaining the software, maintaining the hardware. And so that alone, just the maintenance aspect of it, should reduce some of the burden on IT. But there are degrees of that burden removal depending on the supplier you're talking to. I would say some, you might not see anything different. What it was yesterday before it got a new name, it is today. But with some, you will definitely experience a significant difference in the way that you design, that you deploy, that you use, and you maintain those systems. and you will feel a significant difference in the burden on IT.
2,000-person enterprise with 20 to 30 sites has somewhere between 80 to 110 pieces of network infrastructure that they're maintaining.
Sure.
And that's circuits, routers, SD-WAN appliances, firewalls, remote access, something, probably VPN, whatever they're running for their VPN, probably on top of their firewalls. Plus you have your identity. What's your identity provider? Are you actually connected to the identity provider with any of these things, or are they standalone? And you say maintenance, and the issue of maintenance, if you have to do a firmware update on 100 devices and they take 30 minutes a device, you have a very simple time issue. How long does it take you to actually roll out that firmware device at 30 minutes per times 100? And then nobody wants to do this during work, business hours. So then you have to do it after hours. So now you have less time that you can actually do it. And then the enterprise has a change control process where they only allow updates to happen on certain days, at certain nights, within certain windows. That reduces your threshold. You have to go through probably a committee to measure the risk and approve the activity. And that narrows your options as well in terms of how much time it takes. So to roll out a firmware update across 100 devices, if you can, for some reason, do 5 devices a week, you have 20 weeks of maintenance. And by the time you're done with that maintenance cycle, you have other updates that have already come out that you then have to plan for and continue to update across. And that's for a simplistic environment. You talk about these retail organizations, got 100 stores, 500 stores, 1,000 stores, 2,000 locations. Okay, great. Now apply a firmware update across 4,000 devices in a meaningful way. And this is the other side of it. Like this is the, like, we can't even control our own estate in a lot of these things. Like, our collective houses are in order. I mean, some of these manufacturers, I mean, I won't say them, but they released a security notification, and their remedy wasn't a firmware update. It was replace the box. Like the physical box that you have is compromised. There's no way for us to fix it remotely. You have to replace them. Okay, great. What do you do with that? Okay, so maintenance. How like I find that like that walks into this thing of like there's still this perception of if I displace my job, like if I'm not doing the firewall updates, and by the way, I see this perception also from like junior people inside the organization, but also more senior people inside the organization that maybe are managing these teams. But if we're no longer the ones doing that work, and now we've displaced it to a supplier who's taking care of this for us as part of their service, what does that mean for me and my job? And there's a lot of fear associated with that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think this is where enterprises, businesses have an opportunity to reevaluate those priorities. For say this mid enterprise example that likely doesn't have 1,000 IT personnel. Maybe they have 5. They only have time to run through that cycle of maintenance. That's about it.
Yeah.
What about all the other risks of the business? What about end user education? What about evaluating some of these other services like CASB and DLP? Maybe they want to. They just don't have the time or the resources to do that. Let alone then say they make the decision to go with it, the time or the resources to then manage them on top of managing just the edge hardware, the iron. So I think that there are a lot of organizations, they're behind. They want to get further ahead, but they can't because they have the burden pulling on them constantly of maintaining the technologies they have in place.
Burden is such a good word for this. I always put it in terms of context of like the value that you're presenting to the organization is not that you've applied a firmware update, right? It's helping the organization win at whatever it's trying to do, and I would express it simply in like capitalistic terms. A company that is making money and growing hires more people and produces more economic success, for everybody inside of that environment. Companies that are on the decline are the opposite, right? Like now you start talking about how do you squeeze efficiencies? How do you operate more effectively? How do you lay people off? Like all these other things start to happen. And, and, um, and even though, IT gets into this like role of, nerds typing on computers, it's a customer service organization inside of a company, right? Like IT exists to help the other lines of businesses excel at whatever they're trying to do. And I find that disconnect is really telling in terms of the health of the organization as a whole. Like, you can see it when like, oh, we're actually helping create value and create leverage, or we're not. And you're like, okay, I know everything I need to know about your company now just by talking to, the IT people a little bit.
And the irony in that is, regardless of which profile of an
Mhm.
organization you are, the risk is still there.
Oh boy. So why not do this with why not do this with your traditional firewall, right? So now we've got this thing where the firewall manufacturers are acquiring SD-WAN functionality and they're shoehorning it into their firewalls, or they're wanting you to buy an appliance to stick in front of your firewall, however the architecture is. And of course, in their firewalls, they've always touted that their firewall does deep packet inspection and unified threat management and all these other things. Why is that not a good? Why is that bad? I'll use this really like simplistic language. I won't say like sophisticated stuff. Why is it bad to continue down that path versus figuring out how to pull a ripcord and getting out of it?
The prospect of a firewall
Mhm.
in general, sitting at your edge, doing what it's always done. I mean, that idea of having that device do that is changing, right? It needs to change. It's a finite resource, but the world of cyber is not finite. It's infinite, right? It's constantly evolving, constantly changing. But you've got this investment in a finite resource sitting at your edge that has to keep up with that. And that's just an impossible task. Long term, that's an impossible task. Or we'll go back to the word burden.
Mhm.
You're constantly living through life cycle management of hardware every 3 years or every 5 years, and something new, something bigger. And am I going to get it right this time? That's going to buy me the next 5 to 10 years, or am I not? Am I going to fall short and have to sacrifice on the types of protections that maybe I want that box to do because I just don't have the resources to keep up? I think that's one thing that really compels enterprises to really consider where that inspection resource exists. And if you put it at the edge, you have a timeline, a very specific timeline relative to doing that. If you put it in the cloud, well now you've adopted a model that is supposed to deliver scalability, flexibility, agility, right? It's supposed to be elastic. It should be able to keep up with what your requirements are today. And if they change tomorrow, no big deal. Let's add what we need and keep going. And I don't have to worry about a piece of iron sitting at my edge. Now, in contrast, the networking side, it's not as changing or as evolving, right? We've got SD-WAN today. Chances are SD-WAN's probably going to serve a functional role in the capacity that it is for quite some time, right? It's not going to change. So yeah, stick that on a box, put it in your office. Logically, because you need some way to on-ramp to whatever service you're trying to get to secure your traffic or to secure your users or resources. But that's okay. That makes a lot of sense. It's still on a piece of hardware. But it's got a pretty basic fundamental role, and that is securely get me to the next step, which is securing my users, securing my traffic, and put that next step in a cloud somewhere so that I have ultimate flexibility. I have ultimate agility for my business.
I had a client about 10 years ago, a VP managing VP of IT globally, made an expression which was that he viewed his offices as Starbucks, and how they approached their office strategy was the same as Starbucks. Now, he was ahead of what would then become like this idea around zero trust and how do you actually secure the remote user and all these different things. But his goal was just somebody could come into an office and sit down and get on the Wi-Fi or plug into into the wall and have a really good experience and fast internet, and it would just work. But there wasn't any sophistication there. Like he didn't assume there was any. It was just, this is just a fast internet location for you. Now that I've I've seen this concept now, like fast forward to today, right? We've got way more sophisticated technology and techniques, and we can, segmentation and zero trust and all these different things that start to apply. But this idea has now, I think, fast forward and become really common of like, oh, our offices are just a place for people to be at any given time. It's not necessarily the place, it's just a place. But now you get into this, I think this becomes this a point of pressure, right? Like how much money do you invest in something that you kind of consider as, like a place that has no real value to you in terms of like your IT operations versus investing in things that actually are going to improve that experience. So the question becomes, CATO sells the access component of it, and part of the value of CATO is you have your cloud, right? I'd say you have like a federated and platform that everything flows through, and the access component of that means that you have data flowing to and from your gateways. You have devices connected to the internet around the world that whether I'm a laptop user, a phone user, or an office user have to connect to, right? So that creates cost for you, which then gets expressed down the chain of, cost plus value plus service equals, subscription to the customer. But now customers have to evaluate, okay, I've got this office that I, quote, don't care about. Justify spending more money beyond what I'm spending on internet circuits to provide here, especially if I can go to another manufacturer and buy an SD-WAN component that can give me circuit failover. We can argue about whether it's good or not, but it'll give me circuit failover, and I don't have to, and the cost is different.
Yeah, and honestly, for some enterprises, sure, maybe you don't need SD-WAN. Maybe you just stick an agent on your endpoint and you operate like a Starbucks. We come in, we dock, we work, we're good. But there is a it depends factor, right? What types of services are those users running? Are they on Zoom calls or team calls? Are they running real-time applications and services? Do you care if there's a service impact? Because if you're running an agent only to connect to some resource or to that SaaS application, and that agent really only knows one logical path out, and there's no protection around the service uptime of that Starbucks, is it okay if there's impact that's felt that terminates that call or impacts or degrades that call? How important is that to the business, right? Because I can't tell the business that's important for them, but I can ask the questions, right? And is it just that there's a risk towards Zoom and Teams? What about other services that they're accessing, other lines of business applications that they're accessing? Could they be materially impacted by a service incident at the edge? If the answer is no, we don't care. That's okay. Well, hey, we'll just hop right back on the Teams call. No big deal. Maybe there's no application for SD-WAN in those cases.
I think a lot of places don't care until they care. Like security we were talking about earlier. Maybe they don't care until they care, right? How do we help IT teams, I don't want to say educate, but communicate better with the rest of the company of what these decisions actually mean for the business and business operations, right? Because an IT team obviously cares if users are having bad experiences because they're getting the phone calls. It's part of whether they're being judged directly in some sort of KPI or measurable metric, or if they're just getting like, oh, our platform sucks. Nothing ever works here properly. They are the recipient of that judgment. But how do we help them communicate this internally better so that way there's other stakeholders at the table making informed decisions that actually understand what these trade-offs mean, and even if it's not quantifiable in terms of the expression of ROI, but actually get what they're buying or what they're not buying.
Well, I do believe that when you buy into sort of that agent-only model, you give up the right to having, at least from a network perspective, control and visibility. And it's a big sacrifice to some, but maybe to some it's not. And I think that as long as there is a concern that their users are going to potentially be at risk of poor experience and that they're going to need to deal with that, then it's logical that there should be some investment made into dealing with that. Now, maybe it's SD-WAN. Maybe SD-WAN will mitigate some of that risk, right? That could be impacting the experience. Maybe it's digital experience monitoring. Let's get more visibility into that end-to-end experience so we know what's causing it. Maybe that then tells a story about where that issue is. And hey, back to SD-WAN, right? Maybe it's wireless LAN that's an issue, or maybe it's a problem on the endpoint itself, or runaway processes that are impeding on the user experience. So DEM digital experience monitoring is it's a newer tool. It is something that recently we've introduced in the CATO SASE cloud platform, fully integrated or a component of converged into the SASE cloud. It's fundamental. I come from that world, the support world, the networking world. If we had anything like this 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I think the 12 years I spent as an MSP may have actually only felt like 12 years. Unfortunately, it felt more like 30 years. But I think that you need it somewhere, right? You need to either mitigate the risk through some sort of last mile optimization technology like SD-WAN, or you at least fundamentally need visibility, because it will happen, right? It will happen. Your users will complain, this is not performing well. This is locking up. I can't get to this page, right? So you need some level of visibility in the end. Whether or not you need control is another thing, but you at least need some level of visibility.
A friend of mine was at another SD-WAN platform. His line was, I love his line, time to innocence. He always expressed this in terms of like time to innocence for the IT teams.
Yep.
And and it was, it was always like, I think his favorite example is Salesforce. It's like, no, the network's fine. It's actually Salesforce that's having a problem, and I can prove it, and that was that time to innocence. And digital experience monitoring has been around for a long time. I mean, it was a Keynote, years and years ago, was doing web performance monitoring, and there were network application monitoring, but it was this thing that like nobody wanted to buy them because they were so expensive and they couldn't justify the purchase. And like so it's like having it as a component of something else that's already being deployed, where now you get the information. Once you start seeing it, you never want to go to a world without it again. It's this crazy thing where people that don't have access to data don't understand the value of the data, and they get access to the data, and then they never want to give the data up.
Right.
So it's kind of like, how do we get these like
you can't believe how long they've lived without it.
Oh yeah, so then you're like, well, how do you Trojan horse this into more things? Well,
I think a lot of what you were asking earlier about, how do we convey the message to an IT organization? A lot of it's just showing. You have to show them, right? If they've never seen it before, they don't quite understand the value of it. So you have to show them, like, this is something you've never been able to see before. What would you do if you could see this? What kind of answers could you get to, and how quickly could you get to those answers if you had this resource, this power in front of you?
Well, it's not just digital experience monitoring in that case. In your example, it's also your your application catalog, right? And shadow IT. We always talk about like shadow IT, and then you talk to companies and you're like, how many applications do you have? And like, oh, we have, 5. And you're like, well, have you run anything to actually tell you? And then you turn around and you're like, we're running 15 applications per employee on average, times, like the quantity of employees. We've got 700 applications in a company of 170 people. And you're like, what are you talking about? How did this happen to you? Well, we didn't know. People just used their own credit cards and subscribed to everything under the sun.
Right. It's a valid reason for why CASB exists. Access to shadow IT, and it all ties together, right? It all ties together in the end. Visibility and data is everything.
Expand on CASB for me, because the simple example I was given years ago, which I like, was like CASB's data at rest versus DLP and data in transit, which I think kind of quasi explains it, but it's still, you have different goals with CASB and DLP, and why you would have one versus the other, and why one's foundational to the other, as you're layering.
Well, I mean, CASB starts purely from a visibility standpoint. What do we have? You mentioned a moment ago, shadow IT. what am I using that I don't even know that I'm using? And that's what CASB initially exposes you to. And it does all start from, well, what supplier of CASB, to what extent do they know about the application landscape, right? What does their catalog look like?
Mhm.
And you hear companies like Netscope who've been in this field for a long time, who do really, we've got 70,000 applications, and then Palo comes with, we've got 70,001 applications, and in the end, it's like, okay, hold on a second. To the enterprise that's using this, who only uses 50,
Or only thinks they're using 50.
or only thinks they're using 50, chances are they're not using 70,000.
Right.
What's important to them? But there is a definite value associated in what that application catalog looks like from the supplier, right? I don't know that 70,000 is necessary anymore, as chances are that more than half of those are from 10 years ago and beyond that nobody really uses anymore. But
FileMaker. We know about FileMaker.
FileMaker, that's right. But yeah, it starts with visibility, and it is important to have a supplier that has a healthy catalog. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to identify. Once you have visibility, and it's like, now what do you do with it? Right now, I know what users are using. Sure, I knew about some of them before, but man, what is all this other stuff?
Mhm.
What do I do with it? What does it mean to me? And I think what CASB then takes beyond visibility is assessing the risks associated with those applications. What does this mean to the enterprise from a risk perspective? And if you can have that assessment element after you get visibility, the next step is then asserting control, asserting enforcement. Let's take these necessary applications and let's call them sanctioned applications, and let's make sure everybody has access to those. And let's look at the rest of the stuff and make a different kind of determination. Maybe they're unsanctioned. Maybe we need to control based on their general risk. Let's, everything under risk X, let's just, siphon out into the ether, right?
Right.
We're not using those. This is where things go beyond just the SWIG functions, right? SWIG is so rudimentary. It's necessary, don't get me wrong, but it's very rudimentary. CASB kind of takes you to a whole new level of exploring control for your enterprise, and it doesn't have to be a super rudimentary approach.
Risk. Do you have data and platforms you don't? I mean, it was really easy when you had an enterprise and everything was on premise and your server was on premise and everything was just there, and like you were surfing the internet or maybe using AOL Instant Messenger to chat with people, right?
Right.
Which was relatively easy to block, and then Yahoo Instant Messenger became popular, and that thing was impossible to get rid of. But it's also like it's other things. It's like, what are you spending money on? Do you know that you're spending money on this stuff? Do you know that you've got 4 applications doing the same thing that different teams and different departments are using? Does that matter to your finance team or not? Like if you can make an organizational wide layer to say we're going to use this tool versus this other tool, so we're all on the same tool and we have a common expression of how we work together. Like, does that help the organization? Like, how do you quantify that in ROI? Right? I mean, it's again, it's one of these strange things where like until you actually have the ability to make that decision, you don't even know that you have that choice. It's hard to say like, is that valuable to you or not? And you say, oh yeah, no, we can actually say we're going to use this platform to talk to each other on, and that's it. It's very interesting when you run something and somebody sees it for the first time, and then they actually have to go down the list and be like, what is all this stuff? And
Yeah.
now what do we do with it?
Yeah.
It's I don't want to say it's funny as an outsider, but it's always interesting to have that conversation after the fact with somebody.
Look, I've had many a eureka moment on calls, on doing demos, or just enabling the service for the first time in production for a customer. There are definite eureka moments, or like, wow,
Yeah.
I had no idea what I was missing.
I'm gonna bait you with this one a little bit. ZTNA or SDP versus VPN. and and here's the bait. The bait is well, ZTNA is VPN. What gives?
Well, this one hits home for me because I do see this ZTNA versus VPN story play out in social all the time. For me, ZTNA, first of all, ZTNA not being a product, but rather a strategy
Okay.
to use the products or tools or services that we have in play. For me, VPN is just one of those tools or services that are in play. Now, how we implement that VPN tool determines whether or not we're following a practice that allows us to adopt a ZTNA strategy or not. VPN, and without getting to Wikipedia on everyone, it's a virtual private network, right? It's an overlay type of connectivity or access method, right? It's all it is. Now, you could turn it into a whole bunch of things if you want to, but that's what it is in a nutshell. So most ZTNA solutions out there, there's still VPN solutions. There's still we're encapsulating and encrypting traffic out to this gateway. Now, whether the gateway is on-prem or in the cloud, it's still a gateway. You're still fundamentally performing a virtual private network to that endpoint. So for me, it's not a ZTNA versus VPN strategy. It's VPN 2.0, let's call it, right? And with VPN 2.0, we get all this other really cool stuff, right? We can authenticate the endpoint. We can put posture checks in place and say, hey, you can't connect or you can't have access to this resource if you don't have fundamentally these key things in place, like malware protection or a corporate certificate. I need to know who you are, right? I need you to authenticate to your IDP, and I need to be able to validate that, right? These aren't things that were necessarily a part of VPN 1.0, but they can be a part of VPN 2.0 and beyond. And so to me, ZTNA is just the way that we're using the same types of overlay technologies that we had before. And maybe some nuanced characteristics from one supplier or another who differentiate. Oh, we're doing IP obfuscation, right? It's the next best thing. It's so secure, and for me, it's like security through obscurity. It's like we can NAT. Did you know that VPN solutions can NAT? We can do some natting in between them, even the old school Cisco ASA, you can NAT, right? You can have a dedicated IP pool just for your remote users that don't put you in the data center on the local LAN. I think that was the big motivation between people kind of going against VPN. I think it was maybe certain suppliers out there who thought VPN only existed in a certain operational model where a remote user owned an IP inside of the data center. And yes, there was a time where it was like that. But man, we evolved past that like a decade ago, right? Before ZTNA really hit the market strong.
I mean, IP obscurate. Oh wow, I'm not gonna be able to say that word
It's
now.
not a fun word.
It is cool, but it doesn't. I've yet to hear anyone come to me with a business requirement saying that we have to do that.
Right.
It's usually something different. It's usually something along the lines of, lately, right now, I put into really two things that I hear a lot. I hear we have a requirement that only corporate-owned devices can access client data. So it gets expressed to me that way, right? Like, how do we do this? And the answer is, well, like everything else in tech, you can do it like 50 different ways. And like, here's your options. And let's talk about this more and what you already have and what you're trying to get to. So I get that. The other one I get is we need to actually be able to audit and report on our remote access users. Who connected, where they were, what did they do when they connected, what happened in those sessions. And we're unable to do that in a way that actually meets our auditor requirements with our existing VPN solutions. And whether that's, and by the way, that could be your like legacy manufacturer-based VPN to a firewall or concentrator, or that could even be like some of these open source tools that are out there that are popular in the market that do not actually give that layer, level of granularity of actually being able to say, this person connected this time and did these things. You say identity and posture check, who, where, I mean, it's pretty amazing once you actually see one of these things of like, oh, we can actually tie your identity to our identity provider, Entra AD, Okta, like whatever you're using. And by the way, this was Colonial Pipeline, right? They had a VPN concentrator with credentials that weren't connected to their identity and, got exploited. But we can, just having like strong identity connection is pretty cool. And then you could say, okay, now you can do posture check. And And, are you on a device that has a certificate that's pushed from the MDM? That's cool. Like, we own the device. It's running our EDR. The EDR is actually running. Patch has been applied. That's pretty cool. That's nice to know. It's in a geographic market where it should be. That's pretty good to know. We don't have time travel capability for an executive that was in LA this morning and all of a sudden is in Shanghai 15 minutes later. It's kind of hard to do, right?
Right.
And then, so you get all these kind of like foundational things, and then you say, okay, now we get to apply a policy after determining those other things, and that policy is you get to access something, right? And if any one of those, other things change, like you no longer get to access it anymore, right? I mean, it's like, again, like in the nerd, it's if you've ever configured VPN, like 1.0, I'll use your terminology, VPN 1.0. Again, if you've done this on an ASA, you're like, I don't know why this is working, but don't touch it again.
Right.
Thing.
Right.
It's so bad.
Yeah, it's definitely fundamentally the same, but with a whole host of new mechanics and control components in play today that allow us to. But this is ZTNA said, here's the definition of what your solution needs to do, but didn't say, and by the way, you can no longer call it VPN. It's no longer VPN.
Well, ZTNA it's commonly used as a remote access, like in the idea, the thought process, but ZTNA isn't remote access. ZTNA is just access.
Correct.
And so whether or not you're remote or I don't even know the difference between remote and not remote at this point for most environments, but it's just an access policy of what do you have to do in order to access data, right?
That's it. In a nutshell, that's it. And I think that it's interesting also that the remote access component of it, or the structure of it, has really been kind of the defined or de facto definition of ZTNA for most, even the enterprise, but certainly for suppliers too. And really it extends beyond that. It really should be a strategy that exists whether you're in Starbucks or you're in the office or you're in the data center or you're on a plant operating.
It's what drives the purchasing cycle.
Yeah.
People aren't showing up and saying, I needed to have strong authentication for my person who's sitting in their cubicle in their office, right? Like I could count the amount of times I've had that request hit me at 0, right? So ZTNA gets defined as remote access because people are looking to fix the remote access issue.
Sure.
And what is the actual issue that they're trying to fix? So, we actually need to have a strong identity posture, or we actually need to have a corporate owned device. We need to get away from personal devices, or we need to, make sure that somebody can't connect then download all of our data. Like there's something else has happened usually that triggers that. And I feel like with ZTNA, it's almost always just this idea of remote access. At least for me, it's always been this idea of remote access. And remote again is like, oh, we want to get to our AWS or GCP or Azure environment, and so therefore it's remote because we know it's not here physically in front of us.
Right. And even if you're that user in the office, that resource is still remote to you, right? And so that's where they talk about, the perimeter is collapsing and, because everything is out there, and we're here. It doesn't matter where here is. We're always over here and it's always over there. And there's the idea of being in a large headquarters with a data center right around the corner on a different VLAN. We're getting less and less. It still exists. Certainly it still exists, but less and less of that. And companies like Zscaler and Netscope and they've done really well because that's the realization that they've seen, and that's the message and the story and the narrative they're telling the enterprise is, look, your stuff's all out here. You need it everywhere. It doesn't matter where you are.
Well, as much as we're now starting to see companies push, return to office, I have my own theories on that one, but we're in a different world. I don't think IT is ever going to assume that everybody's sitting in a physical location full time ever again. Like it's just not that ship sailed. One of the nice things, forget the whole like single vendor definition. Just CATO whether you have the access piece and you've got a box providing the SD-WAN function, or you've got the agent that gets installed onto a device, the experience from the user or even from the administrator at that point is a single platform, right? It's however you're connecting to that single platform. And then all these things that we're talking about become, turn them on or turn them off, keep them off kind of approaches. Can you run me through that real quick in terms of like foundational, like just at the very basic level? We're not doing access. We're just going to put the agent on our devices because we know we want to improve, what's happening. We don't know what's happening with our endpoints, right? Like any one of these conversations, subjects we talk, hit like a nerve, right? So we start, let's get this deployed. But then within that, you've got options, right? You've got SWG and firewall and then CASB and DLP. How do these things layer together?
From the context of CATO, it's really simple. I would contend that everything starts with access. Doesn't have to be SD-WAN.
Okay.
I still see the agent approach, sort of the VPN or the remote access port. That's also an access component, right? It's a means for connecting that user to the CATO SASE cloud platform, right? And the idea is that once you connect, your traffic is now flowing through the platform. It's all there. All the context is there. The traffic is there. So it's as simple as adopting all of these acronym soup of services with the toggle switch in the same UI, in a single UI. I want SWG. I turn the toggle switch on, define a policy. All my context is there. I know the user identity. I've got geo information. So if I want to do some fun geo related controls, whether it's CASB or heck, whether it's SWG, I have that context available. And this context is a single shared context model throughout the entire platform. And it all started with just getting the traffic there. Once the traffic's there, I can now apply all these different inspection engines at the flip of a switch and defining policy. I don't have to worry about integrating my IDP with SWG, integrating my IDP now with CASB, integrating my IDP now with RBI. It's all there already through one integration with that IDP. And that really is where simplicity kind of rolls in, is less integrations, shared context across the entire platform. And you have one place to go where everything is, the metrics, the analytical data, the policy enforcement. It's all in one place.
And this, again, these lines start getting really blurred, right? Because SASE is part network, part access, part security. Like it's like piece that kind of get, shoved together. And then from a cybersecurity practitioner standpoint, the holy grail of concept was, if you get to the level where you can do SOAR, right? But before that, foundationally, it's SIM. Can we collect all this data and shove it into one platform where then we can look at this one platform? I think part of the reason for that is, you want to have all your data in one location so you can do an investigation, right? You can do correlations. But the other part of it was that's what your option was. You couldn't, the average cybersecurity practitioner in an organization, an enterprise, didn't have access to the firewalls. There was another team driving that. They didn't have access to the SD-WAN. Another team had, was doing that. They didn't have access to the endpoint. Or maybe they did because they rolled an EDR out, right? But that also changes again when you get into a single platform where you can now define, a permission set and give access to this data to different people. Do you need access to make routing and firewall changes on it, or do you need access to be able to see it and make decisions based on it, right? Like that changes for people a lot as well.
Yeah, for sure. It does. Would say that it's kind of part of the secret sauce, if you will, is, well, there's a lot of great technologies out there. And they do fundamentally what they're supposed to do very, very well. But one thing that most suppliers and most technologies don't do is sort of instinctively work together, right? They have to be brought together. There's some integration stitched together in some way. And I think that when you have to do that, there's going to be some challenges, right? Challenges, one, in adopting that and doing it to begin with, right? But then maintaining any kind of element of innovation in that. One moves, you now have to move the other one in some extent, right? You have to keep up. And that would undoubtedly inhibit how the other one is moving, how the other one is developing or evolving or innovating. When it's all together in one platform, everything moves at once, right? When CATO decides, hey, we're going to add endpoint context because now we're running an EPP or an EDR, that endpoint context is now available everywhere. Now I'm using that endpoint context in my SWIG policies, my CASB policies, my networking policies. If I do have SD-WAN, now I'm controlling link aggregation or link selection or application priority based on the endpoint context even, right? This is where the sort of single platform shared context model really shows its value. And if you think about that as an IT administrator, as a network, engineer, think about what that power has for you when you can see everything in one place. You can define a policy as simple as, you know what, Windows updates. I'm gonna put a shaper globally to 10%. You'll never use more than 10% of my available bandwidth. I don't need to define what my bandwidth is at any one location because that's already been part of the implementation of that location. I've already defined when I deployed SD-WAN for that location. You have link 1 at this and link 2 at this. I've already provided those values as a part of just a simple deployment. But when I go in and administer it from a global perspective, one rule, and I can adopt a police or a shaper for that type of traffic and change the priority level in one rule globally. That's where the power of simplicity and convergence comes into play.
What a great example that people, I would imagine that next to zero, like almost nobody is probably thinking about that in a selection process or an evaluation process for this. But then how much headaches have you dealt with in your career in IT where it's, oh, Windows update just happened and our entire network just went down basically, right? I mean, This is, it's, CATO has, I kind of group competitors to CATO into two buckets. I would put the first bucket in what was like the SSE vendor where they were dependent on somebody else for access. When I say access in this case, I'll use the SD-WAN as the access piece, right? And then the other side, I would put the traditional firewall manufacturer, traditional, right? They all going to say they're next generation, but the traditional firewall vendors that we all know and love, who've been gobbling up and either building capability or acquiring the capability. Now, some of those firewall vendors, not all of them, have gone out and acquired the entire estate. They've either built it or they've acquired it. Where they bought the SD-WAN or built it. They have the firewall. They have the switch. They have the access point. They have a SWIG, maybe. I mean, now, if you've implemented any of these systems, you kind of understand that they don't all work in the same console and they don't talk to each other. But there is now pressure also on the traditional SSE, competitors where they have to go figure out access now because their access components have been acquired by other competitors that aren't so friendly with them anymore, right? So there's a lot of movement in the space going on right now. And in the case of the enterprise where CATO's coming in, the basic assumption, because you're not providing switches and access points, is there is going to be another vendor still there. They're going to displace whatever components of some vendors. Maybe it's already hodgepodged, right? If you're in the HP world, you were Silver Peak for your SD-WAN, and you had a firewall, and then you had, you were already all over the map. And who knows what happens with Juniper? How do you see this like evolving and playing out over the next 3 to 5 years? Because really, that's the bet cycle for most enterprises now is trying to figure out how do we make a bet that's going to be, people bet in 3-year intervals because that's what their contracting length is. But realistically, they're making like a 5-year bet, 6-year bet,
Sure.
because, you gotta be a crazy person to, run through a 2-year project to deploy a new piece of infrastructure to then to like change it on year 3.
More consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's ever going to stop. But I also do see organizations like CATO are going to find ways to get deeper into the LAN, for example. When we think about DEM and we think about having access and visibility to the full end-to-end flow, there are gaps that SD-WAN and SASE have, right? We have the visibility through DEM, but what can we do? We can't do anything to the wireless network. We can't do anything necessarily to the endpoint unless we have some sort of endpoint control. But it's getting closer and closer to the endpoint. And I think that means going further and further into the LAN. So there's going to be some evolution, right? CATO's SASE didn't start at the same time CATO started, right? CATO was founded in 2015. I think we would argue that we were very much, maybe not exclusively responsible, but certainly had an influence on the sort of the birth of SASE, as it's always been our model, it's always been our approach. But we started not as SASE. We started as this idea that we could deliver a cloud native IT security platform. It wasn't just SASE. It was, what can we do with this? Let's build it in the cloud first, and let's figure out what kinds of services we can deliver. Because if we build it right from the onset, it should mean we have every opportunity to deliver anything that is practical to the enterprise. And certainly, we're not stopping where the definition of SASE stops. EPP is not a current acronym you'll find in the SASE construct. It may become there. XDR is not an acronym that falls into it. Yet these are things that here recently, DEM, I don't think DEM has yet made the checklist, but it could. But these are recent evolutions, platform evolutions that CATO has released just this year alone. And so with that, I would say we're gonna expand and continue to expand further beyond the definition or the framework of SASE. Again, the goal is to deliver as comprehensive of a platform to IT organizations around the world, and that means going further into the LAN. We're going to go further into the LAN.
Mm-hmm. It's I mean, I'll date myself. I started professionally in 1997. So I mean, what is that now? 27 years. 27 years into
It's a
this.
few.
Yeah. If I was smart, I would have signed up somewhere where I could have retired after 20 years with a full pension. But what do you do? It's, when I started, we were in the process of doing token ring to Ethernet migrations. And so it was token ring to Ethernet, and then it became hubs to switches. And then we went through a period of time where just everything became faster. It wasn't necessarily, I feel like there was monumental shifts in technology or improvements in technology. It's just everything got faster. Hard drives got faster, bigger. Computers got faster, bigger. I mean, the user experience is much better now than it was, 20 years ago for sure. Some things we lost along the ways. I mean, if you were a GroupWise or Novell Network person, right? Like, NetWare's, what you could do with identity and NetWare and GroupWise, we're just starting to scratch the surface again on, I feel like, almost 30 years later, right? We're finally getting back to where we were 30 years ago. But I kind of fit this thing now where I look at it and I think about this a lot in terms of, part of it is centered around enablement always for me. Like, how do you help people do more, do better, create leverage, create value, make some portion of their day transparent to them so they don't know it exists anymore. And the other part of it's comes in this guy rails of like, I hate the phrasing of like protecting people from themselves almost. Every threat now is a person-based threat, right?
Sure.
Like, it used to be defined differently, but now if you look at any of the rankings of like what are your actual threat vectors, it's like it's people, it's just what the vector against a person is. And I don't believe in this idea of like people are the problem. It's not their job to like be able to defend every attack that comes their way. Like, it just, you can't, you can't take school, like people off the street and put them up against a professional army and expect to have a good outcome, right? Like, you've got rocks and sticks, and I want you to go battle this other modern, force that has tanks and aircraft and, drones. But, and what I have liked, as much as I don't like all these acronym soup things that happen, what I do like about what SASE is this idea is now it feels like collectively there's this push now to do more for people and like actually try to help along the way with all these different things. You know, IT teams need DIM. They probably have never been able to successfully purchase it. But if they buy something that has it, it's great. It's good for everybody, you know? Like like these are not bad things for people, you know. So anyways, I'm going to go on like a soapbox rant here for too long, but
No, I think enablement is it's fundamental in every sense in where we're going, where we are already, and where we're
Mhm.
going. Um, we're still out educating, right? You know, SASE is 5 years old, right? It's crazy to think that it's 5 years old,
that's
but
that's just weird.
we're out educating. So much of it is education, and I think that honestly, the diversity in the market with what SASE is, um, really compels us to really get after it and do a lot of enablement, do a lot of educating, because there is a lot of differentiation in it does mean something, and these differences do yield the different value down to the enterprise in the end. And if the enterprise isn't challenging on their own, if they're not saying, how do you do that? Show me how you do that. Then I think in a lot of cases, they're walking into something that they expect to be something that isn't in the end or might not be in the end.
Mhm.
So enablement is a huge part of this.
Yeah. Mike, thank you very much.
Yeah, man.
I think we went around the horn here a little bit.
That's what these are all about,
But
right?
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it, Max.